Monday, November 15, 1971. At approximately 10:30 p.m., 50-year-old Dr. Charles Cottrell arrives at his home in the Fort Hill section of Charleston. His wife Betty and her younger daughter Teresa were already home. By all accounts, the family had spent a peaceful evening dining out at a downtown restaurant. Just what transpired after Dr. Cottrell returned to his suburban residence remains the subject of conjecture. At 6:30 the following morning, the Cottrell's daughter, Teresa, awoke to a gruesome sight. At some point during the night, someone had brutally taken the lives of both Charles and Betty Cottrell. No arrests were ever made, and today some are certain they know the identity of the killer. Some are still not so sure.
The murders of Charles and Betty Cottrell put an exclamation point on 4 of the worst days in the region's history. Beginning on Friday, November 12th, 11 persons in Kanawha County succumbed to what authorities described as unnatural deaths. While most of the incidents were quickly wiped from the blotter, the case of Charles and Betty Cottrell proved a tougher nut to crack. Today, many feel the answer to the mystery came 6 days later, when the Cottrell's son, Charles Jr., died in a deliberate auto accident in Ohio. Others, however, feel that the death of the Cottrell's son may simply have provided the real killer with the perfect cover for the perfect crime. Was Charles Cottrell Jr. guilty? You will have to judge for yourself. This feature was filmed with the complete cooperation of the Charleston Police Department and the West Virginia State Archives.
Charles Dowse Cottrell II was born in Glen Jean, West Virginia in 1921. He served in the United States Army from 1942 to 1946. In 1948, he graduated from West Virginia University, and 4 years later, he received his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. His medical prowess led him to serve 2 years in the Army Medical Corps during the Korean conflict. After the war, he made his way back to Charleston, where he opened his own practice in 1954. Charles had a son, Charles Jr., and a daughter, Sharon, by his first wife. In 1964, he married Betty Jo Loy and took on the role of father for her young daughter, Teresa. By 1971, Charles, Betty, and Teresa were living along Sheridan Circle in the upscale Fort Hill district just south of downtown Charleston, a neighborhood which could easily serve as a poster child for American post-war suburbia. As far as anyone knew, all was well with Dr. Cottrell and his family. However, this facade of upper-middle-class bliss was soon to be shattered. At some point during the night of Monday, November 15, 1971, both Dr. Cottrell and his wife were shot in cold blood in their own den. The murder would not be discovered until the following morning, and the ensuing days, weeks, and months would see a prevailing sense of fear sweep through the city. Nerves were on edge. Purchases of handguns and shotguns increased dramatically. And, as per usual in any high-profile investigation, questions and speculation as to the identity of the killer or killers spread like kudzu. With no eye or ear witnesses, investigators with the Charleston Police Department were left to piece together the events based on the Cottrells' last known movements and what little evidence the crime scene was willing to divulge. Little by little, authorities managed to roughly reconstruct the Cottrells' last night. Most of what follows is drawn from the official investigative report prepared by the Charleston Police Department. Much of this information is being presented here for the first time. It is being made available with the complete knowledge and permission of the Charleston Police Department. Police learned that hours before the estimated time of the shooting, Teresa and Betty Cottrell had spent most of the day shopping. They were known to have visited Lance's card store, Emby's on Capitol Street, Coyle and Richardson's department store, and Stone and Thomas department store. At around 7 p.m., they visited Dr. Cottrell at the Atlas building on Quarrier Street, where he kept his private practice. Shortly thereafter, they all dined together at the Quarrier Diner just across the street. Betty and Teresa left the restaurant at approximately 8:15 p.m. and returned to the family home on Sheridan Circle. Dr. Cottrell left the restaurant at the same time and made his way to the Macmillan Hospital a few blocks away. Dr. Cottrell advised that he had to check on a few of his patients and make a few telephone calls. He told his wife that he planned to be home in time to catch at least some of the Monday Night Football telecast. Witnesses reported that Dr. Cottrell left the Macmillan Hospital at approximately 10:15 p.m. Reports of Dr. Cottrell's demeanor upon leaving the hospital were contradictory. One nurse described him as being in a jovial mood, even more so than usual. Another described him as being, quote, nervous and apprehensive. At 10:30 p.m., a resident of Fort Hill reported seeing Dr. Cottrell drive by in his 1971 Pontiac Granville, heading in the direction of his home, about 2 blocks away. The witness reported that Dr. Cottrell was alone in his car and seemed to be driving a bit faster than normal. Police believe the witness's account was credible and therefore estimated that Dr. Cottrell arrived back at his home at or just before 10:30 p.m. Upon his arrival, Dr. Cottrell contacted a patient who had called his home while he was out. The call was placed at approximately 10:30 p.m. The patient recalled that Dr. Cottrell's voice sounded normal, although he ended the conversation somewhat abruptly, stating, About 15 minutes later, at 10:45 p.m., another patient, whom we will call Sarah Jones, called and spoke with Dr. Cottrell. Sarah later reported that she felt something was off about the way he spoke. She described his voice as funny, and found it odd that he addressed her as Mrs. Jones when he routinely called her by her first name. Thinking Dr. Cottrell was simply upset at being called at a late hour, Jones took Dr. Cottrell's advice and terminated the call. By all accounts, this was the last time Charles and Betty Cottrell were confirmed to have been alive. Nearby residents reported neither hearing nor seeing anything unusual during the overnight hours. The Cottrells' daughter, Teresa, later stated that she had gone to bed at 9:30 p.m., just after the conclusion of the television program The Lucy Show. She slept soundly during the night and was never awakened by any strange noises or movements. Even the Cottrells' dog, a collie named Princess, was said to have been completely silent during the night. Whatever transpired during the overnight hours had apparently gone down swiftly and quietly. At around 6:30 the following morning, Teresa got up and out of bed. She was puzzled to find neither her father nor mother in their bedroom, and their bed still made. Equally curious, she found the door to Charles Jr.'s room open, even though it was normally kept closed to cut down on dusting. Teresa next made her way to the den on the home's lowest level. What she was met with was truly a macabre sight. Charles Cottrell lay sprawled out on the floor just in front of the fireplace, and her mother was sitting limply on the couch. Neither moved a muscle, and both were covered in blood. Charles and Betty Cottrell were dead, shot multiple times through their heads and bodies. Despite her shock and terror, Teresa managed to telephone the Charleston Police Department and give them a rudimentary description of the situation. Shoeless and attired only in her nightgown, Teresa fled the home in tears just as the first patrolman arrived at the residence. Within minutes, the morning silence of the Fort Hill neighborhood was pierced by a sea of sirens and a whirl of flashing lights. Teresa met up with a school friend, who calmly led her away to a neighbor's home. Charleston Patrolman Roger Songer was the first on the scene. Chief of Detectives Lieutenant Arlie Robinson, along with Detective Lowell Shamblin, took charge of the investigation. Once the scene was secured, Robinson, along with several other officers, began processing the crime scene. From the outset, evidence was scarce, and the scene itself confounding. Detectives were, however, able to quickly ascertain how gunshots fired in the den could have gone unheard. The room was lined with thick, soft carpets, furniture, and drapes. The decor had done an effective job of absorbing sounds, apparently preventing them from reaching the ears of both Teresa and any nearby residents. Adding to this, an examination of the bodies revealed that the murder weapon had been a very small caliber firearm, most likely a .22 caliber handgun. Dr. Cottrell was found lying on the floor, attired in his trousers and shirt sleeves. His top coat and tan sports jacket with its Masonic emblem were found hanging in a front closet. His tie, a clip-on type, was found on a food tray beside a television set in the den. A dental bridge and his wallet were found very close to where he lay. Police surmised that the bridge had been dislodged upon impact with the floor. Dr. Cottrell's wallet was devoid of money, suggesting robbery as a possible motive. A chair was found tipped over and facing the fireplace, although authorities ultimately deduced that it had been upended as a result of Dr. Cottrell leaping up from a sitting position, perhaps in an attempt to grab the shooter. The telephone, found between this chair and the fireplace, was found to have been disconnected. Dr. Cottrell had been shot a total of 4 times. The fatal shot entered through the top of his head, and 3 additional shots struck the left side of his head, from his temple to his jaw. The absence of any money in Dr. Cottrell's wallet was later found to be doubly unusual. A nurse at the McMillan Hospital later advised that just as Dr. Cottrell was leaving, she had given him exactly $50 in cash, comprised of one $20 bill and 3 $10 bills. Police considered the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. However, no other valuables, many of them in plain view, had been touched. Betty Cottrell was found in a sitting position on a couch a few feet away. She was still attired in the greenish-blue dress she had worn during the dinner outing, but had swapped her dress shoes for slippers. Her head was leaning to her left against a small cushion. Mrs. Cottrell had also been shot 4 times, once in the right chest and 3 more times in the right side of her head. One spent .22 caliber slug was found on the floor, apparently a missed shot. One round was found lodged in the wall paneling between the couch and the overturned chair, along with another in the upper left corner of a bookshelf in the same corner. Police determined that these rounds had passed through the bodies of either Mr. Cottrell, Mrs. Cottrell, or both. In total, 9 rounds had been discharged in the den. This number initially led authorities to believe that the murder weapon had been a .22 caliber automatic pistol. All 9 rounds of .22 caliber short ammunition were accounted for. With the exception of the overturned chair and a disconnected telephone cable, there were no obvious signs of a struggle. Given the position of Mrs. Cottrell's body and the evidence that Dr. Cottrell had leapt from a chair, investigators came to the conclusion that both victims had been in sitting positions just prior to the shooting. This led to the unnerving theory that the shooter had either forced the Cottrells to sit or that the 3 of them had been on friendly or at least non-violent terms before the shots were fired. The overkill nature of the wounds, coupled with the generally neat and tidy condition of the den, left police puzzled. But investigators were most puzzled by what they could not find: a sign of forced entry. Either the killer was a master at breaking and entering, or else the Cottrells had allowed him, her, or them into the home unchallenged. A rear sliding door to the home was found to be ajar. Nearby, detectives found the butts of 2 Benson & Hedges cigarettes and a total of 3 burnt and discarded matches. The cigarettes, curiously, had been pinched out and not ground out. It was determined that they had lain where they were found for approximately 6 to 8 hours. All told, the evidence found in the Cottrells' home did little in the way of identifying a potential suspect. The tense atmosphere around Charleston would soon be magnified. Roughly an hour after the Cottrells were found murdered, word reached the Charleston Police Department that 4 additional persons had met with untimely ends during the night. About 2 miles away, on Daverton Road, the lifeless bodies of Robert Etter, his wife Patricia, and their 2 young sons, Jerry and Randy, were discovered within their own slice of suburbia. All signs at the scene indicated that Robert Etter had brutally taken the lives of his wife and children before ultimately turning a shotgun on himself.
What did you find when you entered the house?
Found first I seen the body of the lady on the basement floor, and then we went up and found the other 3, the 2 children and the husband, in the children's bedroom. Husband was laying on the floor, and the 2 children was in the bunk beds.
Detective Leonard, after investigation, were you able to find what the weapons were, and can you establish for us that this was a murder?
In the basement where the missus was found, we found a broken hammer, and then we also found a butcher knife, which was located in the kitchen sink and had blood all over it. From the looks of Mrs. Eater's body, it appears that the butcher knife was used to cut her throat with. Also, in the bedroom where the children were, from the appearance of their bodies, it looks as if the shotgun was used. And also Mr. Eater's, also it appears that the shotgun was used.
At the Cottrells' residence, patrolman Dave Tucker arrived to fully document the crime scene and collect the physical evidence. Unfortunately, as of this airing, Patrolman Tucker's photographs and diagrams have not been located. Shortly thereafter, the bodies of Charles and Betty Cottrell were removed and taken to Charleston General Hospital for an autopsy.
Well, the latest on it, we're working on the theory that it was committed by someone that knew the people, knew the way around. There's no forced entry. been determined that there's no forced entry, and that robbery was not the motive. Their purses, billfold, and so forth was intact with valuables in them. We don't think that drugs, this type of thing, since he was a doctor, was the motive. His doctor's bag and everything was intact. And also, we can have a cruiser car answering any type of call, and especially a serious call, within a matter of minutes. There's no place in this town we can't get to in 5 minutes, and we always have cars in the area, usually within a minute or two.
Authorities next undertook the unenviable task of alerting the next of kin. Dr. Cottrell's son and daughter from his first marriage were both away at college. Charles Cottrell Jr. at West Virginia University and Susan Cottrell at Chatham College in Pittsburgh. Charles Jr. hopped a commuter flight from Morgantown and was in Charleston before noon. Charles Jr. went to the family home, where he conversed with detectives J.T. Lacaria and J.E. Pauley. The detectives later reported that they found Charles Jr.'s demeanor somewhat unusual and his answers to some of their questions evasive. The 1971 equivalent of fake news would soon enter the equation. On Thursday, November 18th, Charleston's afternoon paper, the Daily Mail, reported that an arrest in the Cottrell murders was imminent and that a strong suspect was being interrogated. This banner declaration also followed a comment made by then Charleston Chief of Police Lawrence Morris. Morris is said to have stated that the list of potential suspects had been narrowed down, quote, quite a bit.
Well, I don't know where this came from, because I most certainly didn't make these statements, and I have been too busy to actually read the newspapers.
In the same report, however, Morris lashed out at local radio station WKAZ, accusing them of contributing to the public's unease through what he called, quote, false and inaccurate reporting. Morris stated that it was reports broadcast by WKAZ that had led to the noticeable uptick in the purchasing of firearms. To say that things were tense in and around Charleston would be an understatement. While the rumor mill churned, the Charleston Police Department continued its investigation. Given that Charles Cottrell was a physician with an extensive clientele, the initial pool of potential suspects seemed insurmountable. A check with Dr. Cottrell's private practice was made. His secretary could only think of 2 patients who might have any conceivable motive for harming him. Both patients were located, interviewed, and ultimately dismissed as potential suspects through general interviews and polygraph examinations. Authorities next focused on those closest to the victims, their family and close acquaintances. Late in the afternoon of November 16th, 2 detectives, along with a representative from the Kanawha County Prosecutor's Office, traveled to Morgantown. Newspapers noted that Lieutenant Robinson was unusually tight-lipped about the trek, refusing to even confirm that such a trip had been made. Such a trip had, in fact, been made. The official report indicates that the primary focus of the trek was to question friends and acquaintances of Charles Cottrell Jr. As the names of those questioned have never been made public, we will also be referring to them by pseudonyms and generic titles. Authorities, in particular, hope to speak with Charles Jr.'s on-again, off-again girlfriend, whom we will call Jane Smith. We feel it is important to note here that Charles's relationship to Jane Smith was not clearly defined at the time of these events. Going forward, we shall refer to Jane Smith as Charles's girlfriend merely for the sake of brevity. Also, should anyone in our viewing audience know the true identity of Jane Smith or any of the other individuals whose names are being withheld, we ask that you please not mention them in the video's comments. Questioning of Charles Jr.'s friends and roommates resulted in mixed impressions and opinions. Some spoke highly of him and stated that he was a good student. However, at least one acquaintance stated that they felt Charles Jr. would have been capable of killing his father and stepmother. They also spoke of tension between Charles Jr., his father and stepmother, concerning his relationship with Jane Smith. They also discovered that Jane had already left for Charleston prior to their arrival. Police next turned their attention to locating the murder weapon. By now, ballistics and the autopsies had confirmed that the weapon used was a .22 caliber handgun. Through their interviews, detectives learned that such a weapon had been kept in the Cottrells' home and that it was now missing. The handgun in question was a Western-style .22 caliber high-standard revolver, much like this one. It could hold up to 9 rounds of short or long ammunition. Its serial number was 1293719. Charles Jr. confirmed the existence of this weapon and advised that it had been kept on a pegboard in his bedroom, along with several other firearms. He described the gun as having a 9.5-inch barrel and being of low quality. He stated that it had a tendency to shave lead from the projectiles when fired. He added that his father had seriously considered selling the gun. Charles Jr. recalled that the last time he had seen the gun was about 2 weeks earlier, when he and his father had used it during target practice. To this day, the presumed murder weapon has never been located. Authorities attempted to ascertain if Dr. Cottrell had sold or attempted to sell a .22 caliber revolver. No evidence to this effect could be found. Despite denials by the Charleston Police Department that an arrest could occur at any time, representatives of the Charleston Daily Mail stood by their initial report. They added that the information relayed to them had come from, quote, high-ranking officials in both city and county law enforcement offices. Radio station WKAZ also hit back, refuting Chief Morris's statement that the station had broadcast false and inaccurate information. A check of the program's scripts was reported to have confirmed their rebuttal. What no one knew at the time was that while police remained reserved and reticent in public, the investigation behind the scenes was firing on all 8 cylinders.
Well, we have came quite a ways on the investigation, but I feel we have quite a ways to go. I would prefer not to go into detail because the case has not been solved, and when the case, if it is solved, I am limited to what I can tell you because we have to still go to court and would try the case.
Are you questioning suspects now?
Yes, we are questioning many people. We're working on many leads. There's a lot of people being questioned in the case, sure.
Based upon what you know so far, if you had to make a prediction, is this case going to be solved, or is it going to be like several other long-standing, highly publicized murder cases that simply don't get solved?
I would like to answer you by saying that we will do everything within our power to solve this crime. We're not supermen, but we most certainly feel that we know what we're doing, and we will do everything that we can to bring the guilty party to justice.
At least one potential suspect, reportedly seen in the Fort Hill area just prior to the murders, was identified, questioned, and cleared. A thorough search of the Cottrells' home all but ruled out robbery as a potential motive, as a large number of valuables both in the den and other parts of the home had been left undisturbed. Mrs. Cottrell's purse was found completely untouched in an upstairs hallway. Police soon became convinced that the shooter or shooters were known by the Cottrells and had been willingly allowed entry into their home and had likely been conversing with them at the time the shooting occurred. With this MO in mind, police contacted Charles Cottrell Jr. and asked him to come in for an interview. Since arriving in Charleston, Charles Jr. had been spending his time with relatives and making final arrangements concerning his father's will and funeral. Those around him reported that he was holding up well, but had been having trouble sleeping and unwinding. A physician prescribed tranquilizers to help him through the coming days. On Thursday, November 18, 1971, Charles Cottrell Jr. arrived at the Charleston Police Department for a routine interview and polygraph examination. What follows is drawn from the actual verbatim transcript of Charles Jr.'s interview.
I slept in on Monday, November 15th, 1971 until about noon, at which time I was awakened by a call from a friend. He advised he had an English paper to prepare and his time was running out. He came to my apartment. I agreed to assist him in his assignment, and in doing so, I cut all of my Monday classes and remained at home the remainder of Monday afternoon. I stayed at my apartment with my friend until about 8 or 8:30 p.m., and I would like to think it was closer to 8:30 p.m. I left the apartment and decided to drive to Glenville and visit another friend. I stopped at the gas station on Beechurst Avenue. I bought a tank of gas and paid for it with my golf credit card. My route of travel was from Morgantown in a southerly direction on Route 73. I turned off Route 73 onto Interstate 79. I noticed my gas tank had not been completely filled. I got off the interstate and finished filling my gas tank at an Esso station and paid with my Esso credit card. I got back on Interstate 79 and traveled south to the exit that leads to US 50. At about this time, I became disgusted with my intended trip and re-entered the interstate to return to Morgantown. There at the US 50 exit, I picked up a hitchhiker. He introduced himself as Bill. The subject was carrying an Army-type duffel bag. He stated that he wanted to go to Pittsburgh. We decided to stop in Morgantown and buy some beer. I took him to the Sunnyside Supperette. Bill purchased a 6-pack of beer. I drove the hitchhiker onto the Greater Pittsburgh Airport and dropped him off. I started a return trip to Morgantown, and before leaving the Pittsburgh area, I became lost. While lost, I stopped and purchased gas. I bought $5 worth. I used $5 of my own money in addition to the $5 the hitchhiker had given me at Pittsburgh. I'm sure it was sometime after 10:30 that me and the hitchhiker stopped for beer.
Charles Jr. also spoke about his gun collection, as well as his relationship with his father, stepmother, and his girlfriend. After the interview, Charles Jr. took the first of 4 polygraph examinations he would take that day. This is the actual transcript of the examinations given that day. The examiner noted an increase in blood pressure on each of the 2 tests. When asked, "Have you fired a pistol in the last week?" he replied, "No." This test was given twice, and the results were the same. The examiner reworded some of the questions, and Charles took 2 more tests with the new set of queries. The examiner also noted an increase in blood pressure when Charles replied no to the question, "Were you in Charleston between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Tuesday?" Days later, the fact that Charles Jr. had done poorly on these tests was reported in the press. What was not reported was that Charles had inadvertently consumed 4 of his prescribed tranquilizers at once, just prior to arriving at the police station. The prescription had actually called for him to consume 4 pills over the course of 24 hours. The examiner noted this on the transcript, effectively making the 4 tests worthless. He recommended that the tests be given again when Charles' system was clear. Charles Jr. was told that day that he had flunked the test. In turn, Charles Jr. had the following exchange with Captain Howard Parks.
I presume that I am your number one suspect.
Son, everyone in Kanawha County is a suspect until we get the right person.
On Friday, November 19, 1971, Charles and Betty Cottrell were laid to rest in Sunset Memorial Park in nearby South Charleston. Following the services, Charles Jr. requested to be taken back to Charleston. He insisted upon altering his life insurance policy so that his girlfriend was named as the beneficiary in place of his father. He purchased stationery from the S. Spencer Moore Company and proceeded to write out his own will. Relatives with him at the time pointed out that his actions could easily be taken out of context. Charles Jr., however, remained resolute. When confronted with concern over the optics of his actions, Charles Jr. replied,
This is the way I understand you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to have a will, and after seeing how fast my dad went, you never know what's going to happen.
Shortly thereafter, Charles, his sister Sharon, and her boyfriend, Andy Pleninger, left for Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. His family felt getting away from Charleston for the weekend would be good for him. Charles Jr. contacted the Charleston Police Department and advised them that he would be leaving West Virginia for the weekend. Just before 7 p.m. on Saturday, November 20th, Lieutenant Robinson called the dorm where Sharon's boyfriend resided. Charles was out at the time of the call. Robinson asked one of those present to advise Charles and Sharon that he would like for them to return to Charleston the following day, quote, so we could talk with them in reference to some things that had to be cleared in the case, end quote. The following morning, Charles's 71 Pontiac Granville refused to start. His sister's boyfriend obtained a set of jumper cables, and the problem was rectified. Charles Jr. advised that he was going to drive his car around for a while to charge its battery. A short time later, Sharon and her boyfriend Andy heard sirens in the distance. Just north of Gambier, Ohio, along Ohio Route 308, the car driven by Charles Cottrell Jr. had crashed head-on into a large tree. The impact caused the car to burst into flames. Charles Cottrell Jr. was killed on impact. Knox County Deputy Paul Rowe quickly determined that the crash was no accident. For reasons known only to himself, Charles Jr. had deliberately driven his car into the tree at a speed in excess of 100 miles per hour. Before noon, a contingent of law enforcement officers and legal representatives were already en route to Ohio. The group went through what was left of Cottrell's vehicle, but were unable to find anything of consequence. 3 days later, the car was dismantled piece by piece under the supervision of the Charleston Police Department and the Kanawha County Prosecutor's Office. Once again, they found no articles pertinent to the investigation. In short, they found no evidence that a .22 caliber revolver had been in the car. Later that Sunday, Charleston Police Chief Morris publicly confirmed that Charles Cottrell Jr. had indeed been a prime suspect in the murder of his parents. Lieutenant Arlie Robinson went one step further, stating that he and the other investigators had essentially narrowed the list of suspects down to Charles Jr. and Charles Jr. alone. Little by little, previously unreported facts about the investigation were revealed.
The door to his room was open. His gun is missing. And the polygraph tests that were run on him indicated he was not telling us the truth. There's discrepancies in story, what occurred in Morgantown There's numerous things that...
As far as you're concerned, does this mean that the case is now closed?
The case is not closed, Bob. We're picking up some loose ends. We'll explore any information that we may obtain.
Not much was said of motive, though it was hinted that a financial dispute between Charles Jr. and his father may have played a role, perhaps aggravated by a reported breakup with his girlfriend. However, at the time, Charles's girlfriend strongly disagreed. In a statement which has never before been made public, the girl we are calling Jane Smith stated that she and Charles had more than made their peace with one another well before the murder. She stated that she had reaffirmed to Charles how much she cared for him, going so far as to say,
"Chuck, I love you, and I'm going to marry you."
According to Jane, Charles had reassured her that he would never do anything to endanger their relationship so long as he could be sure that they still had a chance to be together. It was for this reason Jane felt Charles was innocent. In an emotional closing to her statement, Jane added,
"I don't really think Chuck killed his parents because he knew way before this happened that we were going to see each other over Thanksgiving. And we would talk things out. He said, 'Will you stay with me over Thanksgiving?' And I said yes. And like he always told me, he said he would never do anything to jeopardize our future if he knew we still had a chance. And that's why I don't think he killed his parents, because he knew he was coming back to me."
For authorities, the situation was about as bad as it could get. They had been assembling the case for presentation to a grand jury, but their prime suspect, the lone subject of this report, was now deceased. He had never been arrested, much less tried or convicted. A significant part of the suspective motive had been seriously dampened. The supposed murder weapon was nowhere to be found, and all other evidence gathered up to that point, although damning, was purely circumstantial. To many, the conclusion was obvious. Charles Cottrell Jr., for whatever reason, had killed his parents. Then, under intense suspicion and perhaps racked by guilt, he had chosen to permanently take himself out of the equation, a move which, to Lieutenant Arlie Robinson at least, was tantamount to a confession. However, in the days and weeks that followed, authorities went to great lengths to make it clear that the investigation was ongoing and had not been closed.
It's not closed.
After a meeting with Chief Morris and Lieutenant Robinson, Charleston Mayor John Hutchinson publicly echoed their position.
"The case isn't closed and won't be until we've put all the pieces together. I've directed the Detective Bureau to proceed as quickly as possible to fill in the gaps of information which are still unknown. Until that's done, we won't say the case is closed." Mayor John Hutchinson, November 22, 1971.
In April of 1972, the Assistant Kanawha County Prosecutor, Larry Winter, announced that he would not be placing the Cottrell case before a grand jury. According to Winter, the office simply saw no purpose in presenting evidence, as it would be impossible for any indictment to be returned, even if the grand jury felt a true bill would be justified. With their prime suspect dead and evidence against others even less certain, the investigation by the Charleston Police Department effectively ground to a halt.
Although no arrests or indictments were ever made in this matter, this feature will not include the standard summation of evidence. Reason being, the Charleston Police Department have advised that they consider this matter as close to resolved as it can be, sans conviction. There is, however, one loose thread which at least has the potential to be tied up. The presumed murder weapon, the .22 caliber high-standard revolver, serial number 1293719, owned by Charles Cottrell, has never been located. Determining its ultimate fate could go a long way towards either verifying or refuting the accepted consensus.
The presumed murder weapon was a .22 caliber, high-standard Sentinel revolver with a cylinder capable of holding up to 9 rounds. Some reports listed the gun in question as being of a Western style. According to Charles Jr., it had a barrel length of 9 inches. He also stated that it was of a low quality and had a tendency to shave lead from the rounds when fired. He claims to have last seen the weapon 2 weeks prior to the murders while target shooting with his father. The weapon was widely and easily available during the 1950s and 60s, even being offered for purchase by mail order through Sears and Roebuck. Its serial number was 1293719.